On today's episode of Hollywood Rants, we're going to explore the merger between Warner Media and Discovery. It's been 1 week since this happened, and during that week, it's been fascinating to look at how the entertainment industry has responded to this. Rather than looking at it as, well, here we have Warner Brothers having been acquired by another company after a very disastrous merger with AOL way back in the day, admittedly, has once again been bought and then has turned it into a very big disaster. No, instead, everyone has been talking about how this means there's going to be a lot more vertical integration in Hollywood. It's time for all of these content providers to come together and make even bigger corporations so they can control ever larger sectors of the market. And my response to that is, are you insane? First of all, why would you want to merge with another content company when we've just had one of the biggest mergers ever, an $85 million merger, collapse like a house of cards in front of us? Didn't that say that there's a problem that's going on with the entertainment industry being bought by another industry, or perhaps putting too many of the companies together in one basket? It's not as if Disney has had an astronomical success with its mergers of mergers of Lucasfilm or with 20th Century Fox. What has Disney in fact done with 20th Century Fox since they came together? I'm going to say they're probably looking for a way to offload at least the Fox library to an outside buyer. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'm not seeing them making any moves to capitalize on that investment. Similarly, look at who is merging with Warner Media. It's Discovery. What do we know about Discovery? Discovery is a network that has gone from being worth a little bit under $5 billion not that many years ago to now being worth approximately $16 billion. And that's because it's always kept its eye on the prize. And what was the prize? The prize was that they wanted to service as large an audience as humanly possible. And in the process of trying to serve that largest audience, they have paid attention to what their customers want. They have focused on programming such as HGTV, which services a very definite market. Plus, they have kept their budgets low. So most of their programming has been highly profitable. While we can look at the reverse and see what Warner Brothers has been doing, not even necessarily going back all the way to the AOL merger, but just in the past few years. They have been throwing a lot of money at things that have ultimately not worked, whether it be Watchmen, whether it be the last season of Game of Thrones, which, by the way, destroyed any chance for that to have an afterlife, or even capitalizing on the success of Joker. Now, I'm especially perturbed by the way a lot of the pundits in the industry are looking at this as somehow not a failure of the way the industry is working right now. Had other companies said, well, you know what, this is a sign that we better clean up our acts. What's been going on at Disney, what's been going on at at&t and Warner Brothers is a warning sign to all of us in a company that's attempting streaming, that this is not going to be a savior. It's a warning to every company that was looking for China to be a bailout of bad business practices. Instead, it's being looked at, no, those bad business practices are being rewarded and we should do more of them. Now, perhaps the article was placed by a mergers and acquisitions a bank. I don't think so. I think this is actually what people within the industry are thinking because they don't want to deal with the fact that this particular merger isn't an exception. It's indicative of what happens the more vertically integrated the town becomes. The more vertically integrated the town becomes, the more stupid decisions are being carried out by a larger number of these big corporations who seem to be trying to one-up each other on demented decision-making or short-term thinking that ultimately has no long-term basis in reality. All we need to do is flash back a few months to see Disney saying that everything was now going to be focused on streaming, that they weren't going to even consider the theatrical market to be important at all. And all any of us who've been in the industry for any amount of time could think of is, how demented are you? You are going to be spending a lot of money on the basis of retaining subscribers, as opposed to branching out and figuring out ways to bring in the largest amount of money possible. Now, certainly that's a good decision if you're going to do things like The Mandalorian and other such series. But that has to be based on a solid entrepreneur spirit that can only be found in theatrical. Because in theatrical, you have the ability to have something be a standout hit. You have the ability to make something for very little money that makes a bloody fortune, or going the other way, spend a bloody fortune on something that makes an even larger fortune. But when you're doing something that's based exclusively on streaming, it's something that just enters the world of an eternal block of content that's now all available at the same time. It's not content that is presented linearly the way HBO used to do. Yes, HBO would spend at times what seemed like an irresponsible amount of money on one IP, but that IP might inspire people to try out HBO. And in the middle of that, they would be also partaking in a lot of the B and C product that HBO also acquired. And because it was linear, they could also promote their next big thing and build anticipation. Once you make everything as a block where you, as the consumer, are self-selecting what you want to watch, that means more likely than not, you are never going to discover something that's outside of the realm of a tentpole. Because why would you? What's going to make you discover the next reality series that might be exciting or interesting? There's no way, because you have an endless smorgasbord in front of you of very expensive content that's all top end. And the fact that it basically all sucks is going to be a problem down the line, because then an average consumer will say, why do I even subscribe to this service? Every new show they have is bad. And it causes people to wonder, how is this possible? How is an industry that's been around for 100 years and has been known for creating some of the greatest things, at least from a commercial standpoint, if not necessarily always an artistic one, that have worked? The answer is truly entrepreneurship and having content that isn't everywhere anytime you want it. It's specialized. It's kept a little bit at arm's length. Look at how much success the Walt Disney Company had in re-releasing all of its old animated films on a theatrical basis for decades. And every 7 years or so, they would bring a title back. That built anticipation. It built an idea of scarcity. Once Disney put everything up so you could watch any Disney movie at any time, one of the things that became very apparent is, first of all, Disney's animated catalog isn't really all that big. It's kind of limited. And having it all available at once means that you can go in there at any point and watch Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or watch one of their feature films from the past that you didn't even remember existed, like The Biscuit Eater or something like that. Instead, we get a chance to realize that the computer wore tennis shoes was Disney's norm for most of its production history, while the Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, which now seem to be distant memories, are becoming an increasing part of its perhaps more recent, but nonetheless past. I'm not seeing Disney making that kind of innovative step forward. In fact, I'm seeing a lot of Disney looking at their older IPs and wrecking them. There's something wrong with the fact that the only way you can get original versions of The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast is if you have a laser disc, because everything else is infected with the longer cut, which to me is far less effective than the shorter version. And the new feature film live action version of it of Aladdin, although it's not horrendous the way Lady and the Tramp was, it's still highly problematic and is not something that's going to be a chartbuster or be that especially well remembered. I am going to say that I think the original Aladdin is going to have serious problems in less than 10 years. It already has problems with people who are significantly younger than me, which given my age, that's a pretty damaging thing to say. Because even I, looking at the Robin Williams routines that are depicted in Aladdin, I'm starting to not recognize all the cultural references. And heaven forbid someone was born in the 80s and came into Aladdin in the early part of the or the late part of the 90s or early part of the 2000s. Most of those cultural references no longer had any sort of traction to where you could even recognize what was being parodied. But this is indeed a problem that the industry has. And part of it is because no matter how many times the industry has tried to make itself like a normal conglomerate, it doesn't work. Entertainment is not a common sense or even a predictable corporate structure. It's based on miracles. It's based on gambles that come through. It's not based on something that's necessarily predictable. You can predict with fairly accurate acumen how much a new washing machine will make. Based on the new features you've added, based on some of the feedback from consumers, and based on the designers you have in-house. With a film, you can have all the market tested ingredients that look perfect and you put them all together and you come up with the whiz and you create a disaster. So it's not written in stone. Plus, the entertainment industry has a very dangerous problem, and that is it's based on relationships. And if you have really good relationships with people, they tend not to be within your corporation. They tend to be in the outside world, particularly in the past when there was a lot of packaging. Your job as someone who was in development or in being a creative producer was to make as many relationships with agents as possible because they could ensure that you would get another job. But that meant that you weren't necessarily doing what was best for your current boss or your current corporation. Instead, you were making choices, you were buying things to curry favor with your friends outside of that job, which means that your job was funding your friendships. And therefore, you weren't necessarily making the best strategic decisions for the job because you didn't really care if you got fired. Because of your relationships outside, you could always get another job. This is very destructive for any industry that's creating properties that cost tons and tons of money. Now you're greenlighting stuff that you probably know in your heart of hearts is bad, but you're doing it for strategic reasons. A business cannot survive on that. And for a while, the Netflix model, which was expanding at an incredible rate, was looked at as being repeatable. And I think what caught a lot of Hollywood unawares was that Disney Plus wasn't going to have that same eternal upward trajectory that Netflix had at first, in order to get a doubling of the number of people who are buying streaming stuff. No, that pot of people has remained fairly static. So this outreach was in fact dangerous. And this is made even more difficult when we have an emphasis on building franchises, on building things that are remakes and reboots. Because if you don't have original content, ultimately, you're going to run out of things that people want to see further episodes of or further recreations of the original. Certainly, a lot of the remakes that have been coming down the pipe recently have been disappointments. Do we really want to continue that trend? The other thing to look at is how have outside corporations done when they bought entertainment companies? I can only think of one example that's relatively successful, and that's Sony. When Sony bought Columbia, Columbia was a damaged asset, and because it was coming out of having been pretty much ruined by Coca-Cola. But Sony understood that one of the reasons its Betamax format had trouble was because they weren't in control of content. They were only in control of the machine and its time shifting abilities. And therefore, because they didn't own the content, they were at a disadvantage when VHS became the preferred format. And they felt, perhaps incorrectly, that had they owned a content creator and had made the beta format an exclusive distributor of certain content, that especially in the early days when there was still the lawsuit going on against home recording, that they could have had a much stronger foothold than they ultimately had. Now, when they came in and bought Columbia, Morita Akio, who was running Sony at that time, was very American in his thinking. And so he understood American corporate structures, which very few Japanese companies did, which is why Matsushita, which followed Sony, and trying to impose Japanese style business responsibilities onto a showbiz company, absolutely failed with their purchase of Universal. Not that it was any better than Bronfman and Vivendi buying it, or GE buying it, fared either. All of them failed. Sony worked. Why? Because one of the things that Sony did is they paid attention to who they hired. Now, Goober Peters were terrible, but Sony knew they were terrible, but they needed to make a splash and show that they were willing to spend money. But they were only willing to be foolish for a short period of time. And while Goober Peters were there, they had their own corporate spies paying attention to what assistants were saying, to paying attention to what some of the other execs were saying around the lunchroom. And they did that in a very clever way. It was very Japanese, but they were listening to what insiders said. Who were the good bosses versus the ones who had good publicists? Who were the people who understood how their respective divisions worked? And these were often the people who weren't top of mind, weren't reported on by Hollywood Reporter, Variety, and all of that. These were the people who kept kind of a lower profile. And when Sony got rid of Goober Peters, many people were stunned by the ones who stayed, because they were the ones who no one thought were that big. But Sony knew that these were people who understood the fundamentals of the business. And so they had a lot of success until Morita died and was replaced by the new management at Sony, which, quite frankly, isn't even interested in electronics anymore. Most of Sony's business in Japan is now as a form of insurance, particularly for older people and for nursing homes and medical. So Sony won't say that their primary business is no longer electronics or movie making, but that's the truth, which is perhaps one of the reasons that Apple, when it was kind of sort of looking at Sony as a strategic purchase, because after all, one of the problems Apple had in Japan was that it didn't really have that manufacturing base for electronics the way it needed. And I think once they did the due diligence and realized how much of Sony's business was now in a field that Apple had no interest in being in, they said, okay, we're going to pass on this one. We'll look elsewhere. And Sony, to its credit, maintained a focus on its return on investment. So once Ghostbusters happened and that whole Amy Pascal and that Michigas crashed out. Notice that they reverted to where their profit centers were, which was game shows. Sony's perhaps smartest acquisition of recent had been buying the King's organization and getting the rights to Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune and all the game shows. So they've kind of retreated back into that and have been largely profitable. So I think that Sony has been smart about it. But virtually every other company that's tried to get into entertainment has said this has been a mistake. This has been a failure. I'm interested in seeing what happens with MGM if Apple buys it. Note too that Apple did not go out and buy a bigger company. Apple could certainly have taken over for at&t. Apple could have certainly come in there and bought Universal or one of the bigger companies. Why did they choose MGM? I believe it's not because of James Bond in particular, but because MGM did have at the very minimum production know-how, and they were hungry enough to where you have an infrastructure that's not going to be part of Hollywood bling. They don't have the funds to play that game, and yet they have a golden treasure. So perhaps with that acumen, they can make it blossom. That's what I'm hoping if that deal actually goes through. I'm hoping it's not taken as okay, Apple, you blew it with your streaming service, and so now you're going to squander more money on acquiring content that's largely not good, or are you going to look at them and say, let's get people who have that at least somewhat analogous to Discovery, where you're centered on making sure you survive. You're not feeling like there's an endless supply of money that you can grift off of. And so I'm thinking that we're looking at good positives that could come out of the recent trends if the people who are leading the industry start paying attention to good business practices as opposed to relationship buying. Because let's be frank, that's what a big challenge has been all about. Finally, let's look at what's happened with the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, which does the Golden Globes. It was amazing to me that Burke, who had been there for God knows how many terms as the person who was the front of that company, everyone knew that he had toxic views about diversity and different races and genders. Why would he not have that? He's an old guy. He's in his mid to late 80s, and he's an altacocker. He's like, I've been around forever. Don't question me. I know what I'm saying. I've been running this organization forever. So either like me or get rid of me. And they got rid of him, which was not wrong. And I certainly worked for a couple of monsters in my past, including one old gentleman who, let's say, that people went to his funeral just to make sure he was dead. And he had said to me numerous times, Dan, you have to admit, even though you're smart, you're not one of us, meaning I wasn't white. And he would, trust me, he said worse things to other people in the company. I didn't mind because my big boss had told me, Dan, he can't fire you, just live with it. And me being Asian and me being hierarchical and being told, okay, your money's not at risk, just deal with it. I'm going to say, okay, I can smile at it. My parents, after all, learned that lesson in the post-war period and were able to live through very anti-Japanese feelings, being in Hawaii after Pearl Harbor and then going to NYU my dad going to NYU in 1950. Trust me, by the time Godzilla came out, they were no longer at all dealing with that type of oppression. So that they made sure that I understood how to play that particular game when you're dealing with someone who's a bully and a racist. So it definitely benefited me in my career to have had that experience. Now, with everyone in Hollywood piling on the Golden Globes, I don't think they're paying attention to what they're doing again. especially when they're saying, well, we're not going to go to the next Golden Globes, and even the network saying we're not going to show it anymore. What do you think is going to happen if you get rid of one award show? It becomes very easy to look at all of the award shows and make it very obvious to the public, who probably still has a belief that award programs are awarding merit. They're not. An award show like the Emmys, like the Tonys, like the Oscars, like the Golden Globes was never conceived to reward merit. They were always conceived as propaganda for the industry and to make money. The Academy Awards is almost at its 100th anniversary because for the last 70 of those 100 years, it has made a big chunk of change from television broadcast. That is the reason the Oscars are still done. Prior to that, the Oscars were big on radio. Prior to that, the Oscars were originally formed by the Academy of producers to hopefully block unionization of the industry. Now, that all fell apart within 5 years, but by that point, the Academy Award had caught the public's fancy, so it became a marketing tool. Remember, in 1948, the Academy Awards had an existential crisis when they were concerned that Hamlet winning Best Picture was a mistake. They shouldn't have had that happen because Hamlet was a British picture and wasn't an American movie. That was the thinking. So when we look at the Oscars today and think they were meant to reward merit, no, they're not. They're meant to propagandize why the public should love the Academy Awards. The fact that the show used to be the second most watched program of the year on television, second only to the Super Bowl, and where it is now, with only having 10 million people having watched the last segment of it, shows how much that has fallen. There is no reason for there to be an Academy Awards unless it's a ratings getter. There is no reason for there to be a Tony Awards unless it makes money on television. There is no reason for there to be an Emmys unless there is a show that generates income. And so now, with no Golden Globes, it means everyone is looking at every award show and saying, do we really need you? And the answer is no. Now, with the Golden Globes, this could be very interesting because many people who vote for the Oscars, and I'm going to reveal an industry secret that I'm sure you all know anyway, they're not the people who are necessarily members of the Academy. A large number, I'm not going to say most, I don't want to go that far, but I'm going to say a very large proportion of the people who are Academy members don't see movies because they're too old and they don't care, or they're in a craft so they're so busy working that they don't have time to pay attention to all the movies that are out there. So they ask their kids, they ask, if they're teachers, they ask their students. If they're in an office, they ask their assistants, they ask younger people, what do you think should win? Now, a lot of those younger people don't know anything about what's really hitting, and so they spend a lot of time paying attention because they're working, crazy hours, and they'll watch the other award shows. They'll pay attention to the New York Film Critics, they'll pay attention to the Golden Globes, and they'll use those as guides to determine what they should vote for. And I've got to tell you, I think the Hollywood Foreign Press should seriously consider getting a new marketing or advertising agency behind them, because they have a very good answer for when people were saying, you're not a diverse enough organization. They have been one of the greatest sponsors for film students. And they have given unbelievable amounts of money to community colleges and smaller places. They've funded buildings, they've funded scholarships for students. And guess what? If they're focusing on community colleges and impacted communities, because most community colleges are dominated by impacted communities, There you have your proof that you care about diversity. You are funding large numbers of people who are looking to get into the industry who are from those impacted communities. Why did no one at the Golden Globes and the Hollywood Foreign Press say that? Remember that the Academy Awards, when they floated that cockamamie idea that every single movie had to have a diverse, a certain amount of diversity in their cast. Remember, that was the headline, but if you read those articles further down, you see that one of the ways a studio could get around that, or a producer could get around that, is to reach out to an impacted community, either through a community college or a college or whatever, and give scholarships and internships and all of that. That would cover for that. So the Golden Globes were doing that much more than the Academy was. And they ignored that fact. So I've got to say, they have been very beneficial to my own students. And I'm saying this with all love. Please advertise the fact that you're doing that, and don't cower because Tom Cruise looks at you sideways, or NBC looks at you sideways. You have plausible deniability. Use it. Anyway, that's kind of the update on what I see going on for the past month or so. And I have great hopes because I feel that the quote unquote chickens are coming home to roost for bad Hollywood behaviors. And I'm hoping that we see gap fillers rather than gap ignorers being added to the creative side of it, where you're looking for creating content to audiences that aren't being served. And I don't just mean non-Caucasians. I mean the audience as a whole that's not being served. There are so many communities that are out there that if you deliver a lower budget film to them, they will watch. And that will return a profit. And profitability is the ultimate way of saying that what you have done is good. And movies and television have forever been that highest and best exemplar of meritocracy. That is why, at least, this fat Asian has always loved the movies and TV.
Made a lot of money, didn't it? Money, money, money. I never concerned myself with these matters.